Welcome to Full Speed Ahead. I'm here with Robert Jacobson, the author of Space is Open for Business. Robert, how are you today?
I'm doing excellent. Thank you, Craig.
Well, super excited to have you here. I've enjoyed reading your book, Space is Open for Business. Certainly touches on the evolution of private commercialization and the opportunities that exist in space. I'm curious, what made you interested in this emerging topic?
Well, it goes back about to a specific night, June 20th, 2004. I'd been tracking the X Prize, which was the contest to bring, it was to encourage private investment in space and to get some humans to go to space. And there was a flight at the Mojave Airport by Spaceship One. I got a buddy of mine to drive with me out from Los Angeles to Mojave. And then early Monday morning, June 21st, 2004, we saw the first private flight to space. It was the pre-competition flight, but it was no doubt the first flight to space. And from that moment of being out there at the Mojave Airport, my life was changed forever. And I told myself, I have to be involved in this. I really didn't know exactly what that would look like, and it really set me on a course that's leading us to this conversation today, because I knew it was going to be a catalyst for a major change. It was almost as if, like in the 90s, somebody sort of showed you something like Google and said, hey, how is this going to change the world? It was really that sort of moment for me.
Now, it's interesting, since that flight, we've seen a lot of investment, whether it's Virgin Galactic, to Jeff Bezos' investment, to Elon Musk's company that he's helped incubate. There's been a lot of activity. Seems to be a playground for billionaires, but what are the real commercial opportunities that you think exist for folks who aren't billionaires?
So first, if you're just call a Main Street investor, there are ETFs that one can invest in that are focusing on aerospace. You can also, of course, buy stocks like Virgin Galactic or Boeing. But if you're a more riskier investor, where you're looking at private investments on like the private equity or venture capital or angel investment side, there are now hundreds of new companies, maybe more, that are playing in a very broad way regarding space. So whether your background is in, whether it's you're a software developer, maybe you own an insurance company, I can almost assure you there is a startup that is trying to connect space in that applicable area. And space, like many other domains, requires a wide variety of service provider and infrastructure and things like logistics, which you're keenly interested in, focused on.
And one of the things you talk a lot about in the book is a lot of attention's focused on rockets or getting stuff out of Earth orbit. But actually, the vast majority of investment and opportunities is well beyond that. Where are you seeing the opportunities as it relates to deep space logistics? How do we create opportunities, economic opportunities, whether it's in the lunar landscape or near Earth orbit or beyond?
Yeah, so logistics might win this war. We're gonna probably there's still a lot of difficult pieces to solve to getting humans back to the moon. This is not necessarily an easy task, or setting up large constellations in lower Earth orbit to provide a variety of services for here on Earth. And all of those larger plays, whether it's putting humans back on the moon or the larger constellations, they require things here on Earth. So I would remind the audience that we have communications, where you're going to need communications here on the ground. There's going to be many contractors and subcontractors that are going to be helping some of these government agencies and large companies, get things over the finish line. And the opportunities are vast. So if you're looking at, say, first you alluded to the moon, it's going to be pieces around probably the supporting roles. You've got companies like Lockheed Martin, Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin, that are building things like landers. And I would suggest that the audience, potentially look at what are the supporting things that can be that are sort of like ancillary opportunities for them. In lower Earth orbit, you've got communications satellites, new communications infrastructure to provide things like internet access is one. So you might want to think about the applications that could sit on top of those platforms or serving new markets. For example, I know Amazon is interested in this with their Kuiper constellation. Elon Musk has a new constellation that he's got, I think, some early customers or beta users called Starlink, and they're trying to serve areas of the world of the Earth that are not necessarily served at all or served well with internet access. So if you think about opening new markets, look to whether it's maybe it's Africa, maybe it's Southeast Asia, maybe it's remote parts of North America where they don't have reliable good internet access. Areas that I think are kind of exciting are maybe areas around manufacturing in orbit and life sciences and biotechnology. Well, what does that mean? Well, in lower Earth orbit, you have microgravity, basically, or it's also known as zero gravity. And certain material, when you do things in this microgravity environment, those things, whether it's maybe it's a cell that you're culturing, or maybe it's an alloy that you're trying to develop, they might behave differently. And I'll give you examples. They found that like viruses sometimes lie dormant, the herpes virus, and they've had noticed that astronauts sometimes are having things like the herpes virus reemerge or reactivate in orbit. They've also found that certain bacteria that are very resistant to antibiotics behave differently in microgravity. If we could understand why they have these new characteristics, so recharacterize their behavior in space, we might find some really great novel applications that could be very useful for here on Earth. Hopefully that answered some of that, kind of a two-part question there about the moon and lower Earth orbit.
Well, Robert, you probably triggered a lot of people when you mentioned viruses and their dormancy and then re-emerging, because I imagine this being 2020, COVID outbreaks on lunar colonies or on the International Space Station. I understand they quarantine before they go up there, but this year has been one where the virus has been the story of 2020. One of the things that I found really compelling was this concept of, and you dive into a lot of this, is how much we consume as humans on the ground of materials that are mined, are produced here, that there's a finite amount of that material on Earth. But when we start thinking about the broader universe, whether it's just near Earth or beyond, that opens up a ton of opportunities for resource development. I'm curious, what is it going to take to get to the point where we can start mining resources in outer space?
That's a great question. So for historical context, it was through space flight and through imagery from space that we were first able to see ourselves as citizens of Spaceship Earth, that term that I think Buckminster Fuller coined. And then later, so it's pretty common that humans think of ourselves as, we know that we're citizens of planet Earth, but it takes a little bit more of an abstraction to say, hey, we're also citizens of the solar system. And that solar system does have finite resources, but when you start taking the context of our entire solar system, it has vast amount of resources that Earth, that instead of just mining the Earth, but if we start thinking about the solar system, could potentially take care of a lot of our challenges, because we have these rare earth elements that we need for our cellular phones, our batteries. We're going with further electrification of the planet, and then rather of just purely strip mining the Earth, we should be thinking about how can we smartly and sustainably use resources in the rest of the solar system. I'm not suggesting a complete strip, using all of them, but there is enough for hundreds of generations. But what we need to have happen is lower cost access to space. So thankfully, through smart investments by our governments, that's thankfully through taxpayers and high net worth individuals, whether it's Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, they are investing in radically bringing down the cost of access to space. So although this rocket, right now we're using chemical propulsion, so these rockets are transportation infrastructure, and they're focused on reusability. So instead of costing, say, $10,000, a kilogram or even per pound on getting mass to orbit, there is the potential of bringing it down to sub $20, maybe even sub $10. And that's a radical notion. If you think, say average person weighs 150 pounds or something, you can get 150 pounds for several $100s to orbit. That could free up the number of applications and really allow the entrepreneurial spirits to unfold into the space frontier, to allow us to do things like mining the asteroids and the moon. And what has happened for millions, if not billions of years, is you've had asteroids that have been hitting places like the moon. So at the top surface of the moon, you have littered all sorts of really useful materials from basically this cosmic rainstorm of metal materials. And then you have deposits on the asteroids. So there's lots of really interesting places for us to go. I think in the midterm, you're probably going to see the resources of space extracted and used in space to create an in-space economy. It's probably a lot further out until it's easy enough for us to sort of take a platinum metal and bringing it back at any sort of scale back to Earth. I think at first it's going to be in-space, use before taking it back to Earth, just for some more realistic context.
So, Robert, you mentioned, $10 a pound to get. Is that to get to the moon, or is that just to get out of the orbit, off of our gravity map?
Just off the Earth. Right now in 2020, the range and price to get about a kilogram to the surface of the moon, this is not humans, this is just say non-human payload, is hovering $1 million to $1.2 million a kilogram to get a kilogram of something probably without a human to the moon. But to get off the Earth, sort of say several hundred miles, think of the International Space Station, which is equivalent to the distance of, say, about Los Angeles to, I think, about Phoenix, Arizona, to give you an idea of how many miles away it is, because the edge of space is 62 miles above sea level, or 100 kilometers. And then the space station sits a little further, a few hundred miles above sea level, just to give the audience some perspective.
Yeah, but a kilo going from LA to Phoenix is around, 40 cents a kilo for that distance, but you're not going up. It gets exponentially more expensive when you go up. I'm curious, when you start talking about, $1 million to get something to the moon, that's a lot more expensive than what air freight rates are today, where it's, a couple dollars a kilo from China to the United States. We're talking about something on a completely different level of expense. If you're going to do heavy mining or manufacturing in space, you've got to get that down. What does it take, from your perspective, to really drive down the cost of transportation to get it to a place where it's at least in a place where it can be affordable for scale?
Well, again, for context, the way it used to work with in the space industries, everything was done customized, or onesies or twosies. There wasn't this idea of reusability. There's an idea that the story gets tossed around that if every time you had to fly, if every time you wanted to fly, say from Chicago, New York, you get on your Southwest flight on a 737, you get to where you're going, and then to come back, they had to rebuild the 737. Your ticket price would go up dramatically. That's what's been happening historically with space. When we had the space shuttle, there was a thought that the space shuttle would fly about once a week. That never, or even once a month. That never really happened. So it was very expensive. So what they're having to do is these companies are really focused on making engines that are restartable and reusable like thousands of times. Like that's never been done before. We are on the path to making that realistic option, so that rockets or the spacecraft, the rocket, the launcher is just something, you gas up, you've got your consumable, which is fuel, and that's, you're not worrying about rebuilding the engine every time. You can kind of gas it up and go. I think we're still just a few years off, but it is, it's starting to happen. That's why there's heavy investments on the reusability side of space. Once you're able to bring that price down, and this is an activity that's already happening, but you have the early robotics in space and things like 3D printing and using robots, because there's going to be a lot of activity. Say you're building a bunch of maybe a large solar panel array, or you need to do some mining on the moon. You don't need humans to actually do some of that nitty-gritty tactical activity. You're going to have robots doing a lot of it, and then you're going to have the overseers of being humans. So the great thing about space is we can have a lot of robotic activity, and that will in turn leverage all the things that we're learning about machine learning and artificial intelligence and all the other key things that's already ongoing here on Earth. So it's a great way that space will be able to borrow from some of these other domains.
Is space development and commercialization technology, is it respond to Moore's law? Are we going to see compounding and exponential lower cost, exponential cost drops, as well as innovation? Or how should we think about space commercialization?
We should think about space. We could think of it a little bit like the internet. Go back to the 1990s. We all now rely on all these applications, whether it's through our phone or through, whether it's, you just think of the myriad of applications we all enjoy daily. But it all sat on infrastructure. So even to get Google, which is probably now considered more of an infrastructure company, early on I'd call it an applications company. It needed things like servers. Google required things like companies like Cisco to do what it needed to do. I think space is a bit like this, where we're developing a core infrastructure of things like spaceports, launch facilities, new satellite infrastructure, new types of satellites that are, think of it like your iPhone. We have smaller satellites that have a lot of punch. They're almost disposable. We have that going on with the satellite sector. So as we're building up this core infrastructure, that will then allow the applications developers to create new businesses and new tools that will be useful for us here on Earth and in the space ecosystem. Does that hopefully answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating topic, and one that, I get asked. We've announced SpaceWaves, and people are like, this is cool, but why? And, I talk a lot about the fact that ultimately space commercialization's logistics and supply chain challenges. But it's interesting as you sort of dive into the topic, and you have done this in your book, about where this will end up in a couple of centuries, because I think that's what we're talking about here. Is not what happens next week, next month, next year. Certainly there'll be developments there, but we're actually looking at the future of society over the next couple of centuries and beyond. And one of the quotes that you have in your book is you quote Jeff Bezos talking about manufacturing and heavy industry, and this quote that you took from a conference that he attended in 2019. He says, "I predict that in the next few hundred years, all heavy industry will move off the planet. It will be just way more convenient to do it in space, where you have better access to resources and better access to 24/7 solar power." I mean, is that something that you also subscribe to?
I would say a variation of it. Jeff is what you would call an O'Neillian. I'm probably an O'Neillian, and it's based on the philosophy of the late physics professor from Princeton University, Gerard K. O'Neill, who wrote an instrumental book that was it's probably the Bible for Jeff Bezos' entire life, called The High Frontier. Highly recommended. And in this book, Jerry O'Neill, he was trying to teach students about, it was around the time of the Apollo 11, the moon landing, And some of the students were going, why are we doing this? What are we doing? So he basically wanted to figure out some ways to practical lessons to teach his students about why we're going to space. And in that, they started co-developing ideas of what we could do with the moon or living in free space. And the idea is that using the resources of space, the sun, metals, and other resources on the moon and elsewhere, we can create this really great infrastructure for humanity to both move out on and really thrive, building very large space habitats. And Jeff basically took an extension of that philosophy and said, hey, why not just take all of our dirtier manufacturing, the things that maybe that we don't really, nobody wants to have a dirty factory or having our waterways polluted, and doing that in space. Although we can't yet do that today, it's something we can definitely aspire to, and I'd call it, it's embryonic at this point. But if we just seed the idea with this as a possibility, we can really have a great future. And it doesn't have to be like a dystopian, everybody moving off Earth and moving to Mars or the moon. It can actually be a place where if people want to live most of their life on Earth and then have the retirement home on the moon because it's lower gravity, easier on your bones, or maybe living in a space station with artificial gravity, this is what's possible. Or vice versa. There will be people that will maybe want to live and work in space and on the moon, and they will go to Earth on vacation. It's not going to be an either or. This is about choice, giving billions of people the choice, and giving all humans an even higher standard of living than we live today. And that's a difficult concept to think about, but through the utilization of space and the resources that space has, that is possible. And there's nothing in terms of the physics of it that say no. It's just something we need to start peppering into the zeitgeist of our being.
And energy, and the other thing that is striking is this sort of concept of having solar panels in space that beam energy down to Earth. Can you explain a little bit how that potentially could work?
Certainly. So I'm not what you're referring to, Craig, is called space-based solar power. I am certainly not an expert in this area, but know some about this. So the idea that Professor Gerard K. O'Neill talks about is that you'd have these essentially a solar farm where you put solar power in space and you beam it back down to Earth. So that the terrestrial solar power that we have today, it only has a certain amount of efficiency. But if you put the solar power, the solar cells in space, you could get a lot higher form of efficiency in terms of your use of the panels, and you could beam them down sort of, as through microwave or there's different ways you could beam that down to Earth. And you would need fairly large footprints on the Earth, totally feasible in terms we have the space. You're talking about, outside of a city, you would have a pretty large solar farm. But directed energy could be a weapon, it could be weaponized, and it's not been done yet. But what you're seeing, and why this is an important area still to study, is that the U.S. Air Force actually currently has a space-based solar power experiment testing some of the early technology on they've got this unmanned spacecraft, I think it's called the XB-1, might be forgetting the name, but it's this unmanned craft. They're doing some early tests. China wants to invest very heavily in it. And why I would probably tell Western countries and U.S. government to still continue investing in it is if you can own the future energy supply chain, it's the strategic implications are countless. And China is investing in this area, and it's controversial. There's some people who believe that we can't do this, where I think what's the more likely near-term path is they'll continue to study this, and we will probably see in-space solar power. And what that means is beaming energy to the moon, beaming energy to other spacecraft, maybe to your assets in space. I still think that it's probably, and this is just spitballing from what I've heard from real experts, decades out until you could actually have something meaningful on Earth. But the reason the military was interested in is that's very expensive logistically to move things like diesel fuel around in the war field. So they were looking at how can we just beam energy right to our people in remote bases.
Well, when I played SimCity, there was an option later in the game to have this big satellite dish that you could get power directly to your town, and you solved all your power problems if you got to that point in the evolution of the game. Robert, if we think about short-term opportunities for folks that are in logistics, perhaps that are interested in this sort of emerging category of space commercialization, where should they be focusing their energy? Or perhaps we have someone who is at a university thinking about their career that wants to get involved in space commercialization. What is the opportunities that are more near term that they should be thinking about and getting involved in?
I think it's maybe optimizing that link between communications. We've got all this talk about 5G. It's happening. 5G is slowly being unrolled. And we are also now looking at putting a 4G network on the moon and 5G satellites around the Earth. And what you can do with 5G is it's going to be really important around IoT, and which is basically the connection between devices and machines. And when you're talking about transportation, I think there is numerous ways, whether it's if you think about maybe we're moving some cargo, and you want to be able to change the temperature of something while something is midstream, or you want to know what is its condition, or you're trying to, something that you're trying to move. I think that connection between 5G, satellites, and logistics has a lot of opportunity. So depending on what the listener, what their field of expertise is, whether they have a trucking company or other types of shipping company, maybe they're doing maritime logistics, start looking at like, where are the gaps? Where are you really frustrated? And there could be a space segment that could help fill that. So a lot of that might end up meaning, you don't need to go out and build a new satellite infrastructure because someone else is, but maybe looking at what are the software components, what are the interstitial pieces between in that last mile that maybe could be improved, whether there's another vendor that you could just be a customer with or a partner with, or or co-invest with. That would be my suggestion.
A lot of it's, as you mentioned, communications is key. Certainly the development of the telecommunications infrastructure and a lot of the media that we know and the internet foundationally came through the invention of the satellite. So certainly, I would hope that whomever's building the 4G on the moon would come to Chattanooga, Tennessee, on my mountain, on Elder Mountain, and fix the cellular tower there before they go to the moon. AT&T, we're talking to you. Anyways, Robert, I appreciate your time today. It's a fantastic topic and a really great read. I recommend anyone to pick it up that's interested in this topic. It's certainly something that we'll dive into throughout SpaceWaves, but also beyond, because it's an emerging opportunity. A lot of venture capital is interested in it. And we've seen some public offerings, whether it's Virgin Galactic, SPAC, or others, that have created opportunities for people to get invested in space. A really important topic, Robert. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Greg, thank you. And I really appreciate you guys investing and finding a lot of interest in this area.
Thank you. And thank you. Please tune in for the rest of SpaceWaves. And if you've missed anything or would like to get the content on demand, you can do that through the tv.freightwaves.com site. You can also get it through the Apple TV or Roku devices on the FreightWaves TV app.